So, that was a fun reading, wasn't it? Today we're going to examine the apocalyptic visions of Ezekiel and his message of encouragement, believe it or not, to a people trapped in exile. So we've been walking through the prophets for the past number of weeks. We've done the Assyrian prophets, 4 of them. The pre-Assyrian prophets, 4 of them. Then the Assyrian prophets, again, 4 of those. And then we did the Babylonian prophets. And now we're transitioning into what I've called, that's a bit presumptuous, isn't it? What is known as the exilic prophets, the prophets of exile. And we enter a whole new section, a whole new column. If I'd have asked Rob to pull up that picture, which I forgot to do. Some of you might have it with you, I don't know, but it's that whole new column where the people of God are sitting off in exile. They are no longer in the chosen land, the promised land. They are now off in the empire of Babylon. The conquest is over and you end up losing hope. Ezekiel is right at the start of this, and this is why you get this siege imagery and stuff, and then they get carried off. You'll hear reference in Ezekiel to the rivers of Babylon where they sit. You get that old famous by the rivers of Babylon. Boney M, yeah? Not her or them. Before my time. I know the song, but I don't know the band. But this is lifted straight out of Scripture, and they sit there and they're dealing with this new reality that their temple no longer exists, it no longer stands. Their homes have been gutted and destroyed. Everything's been torn away, and the way that they wanted to live has been done away with. And now, I'm assuming as we sit in exile, I'm assuming that we'd have a whole new bunch of questions. If you are no longer where you're meant to be, if you're no longer in the promised land, you've been taken away. You've got, as a people, a whole new bunch of questions. Maybe you're asking yourselves, are we going to be here forever? Is this just what life is like now? Maybe when we go through hard times ourselves and we feel really distant, from God or from people or from our family and stuff like that, maybe that's what we think. We have that question: Is this really is this it forever? Is this what life is going to be like now? How about what did we do to deserve this? I realized we lost the plot and we went off the rails a bit and we made some mistakes and we did things that God had warned us not to do. But really, did we deserve this? To be utterly destroyed and taken away, and for God's house to be torn down? Maybe we think, has God forsaken us? Not only will we be here forever, but is God even with us anymore? And I think in our world, we'd even question if God was even real. And you're sitting in exile and you have all these new questions, and this kind of brutal reality check ushers in for them, and a whole new prophetic voice is needed to speak into this situation. The exilic prophets are going to be different from the Babylonian prophets. It's going to be a different kind of voice to woe. And as we've looked at the prophets, I think there are 3 words that can sum up everything about that the messages convey. We touched on this briefly last week, but the 3 words that we kind of use are warning, woe, and hope. As I was talking about this morning, Annie says to me, she says, could you not think of another W word? Right, what kind of preacher are you? And I'm thinking, I don't know many W words around hope. Maybe somebody could help me and then I can change my notes for next time. But as you get into the exilic period, the voice really changes from woe to a voice of hope. Believe it or not, as we read Ezekiel 4, which still feels quite a lot of woe, doesn't it? It feels, it's talking about laying siege and all sorts of stuff. But Ezekiel actually does. He ushers into a whole new prophetic day, if you will. And the voices of the prophets in exile begin to take on a different tone than the prophets of the past. And it's not too It's too late for warnings. And the time for preventative repentance is long gone. They're in exile. Punishment, judgment has come. There's no need for a pronouncement of woes because the story has passed. It's happened. And there's no need, if the Jewish people are ever going to come back to the path of God has called them to, they're going to need to understand their circumstances, and they're going to need to see where God is at work within those circumstances. They're going to need to push through and be empowered to choose the right in the middle of the wrong. They're going to need strength. And strength is going to be the right word for Ezekiel. It's actually going to be our word for Ezekiel. You know, if we said all the different prophets, we either have like a word or a motif or an image or something. Strength is the one that we have for Ezekiel. In fact, Ezekiel means God strengthens you. And if you can remember, we talked about, back in the day, back in Torah, in Exodus, we talked about Pharaoh and his heart. And remember the two words for harden. The first one was kavod, and the second one was hazak. And kavod, it was to heavy or to strengthen. And the word kazak meant strengthen, and it's mentioned as well in Joshua. And you get this phrase, and excuse the incredibly dodgy pronunciation as ever when it comes to Hebrew words, but you get Hazak Vakamataz. Hazak Vakamataz is to be strong and courageous. Something that comes up 7 times really quickly in Joshua. Be strong and courageous. It has this dual meaning, even as I listen to it, because on one hand, Ezekiel is going to need strength to make it through his calling as a prophet. He's not going to have an easy calling. I hope you picked that up in that reading. The stuff he's asked to do is not easy in the slightest little bit. He's not going to have. It's not going to quite be Jeremiah. But it's not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. It's a different kind of difficulty. His message is also a message of strength. Ezekiel has been sent to strengthen God's people who sit in exile, who are tempted to succumb to despair and to give up and to lose hope. Ezekiel is sent to strengthen them. So Ezekiel is going to introduce us to a new kind of prophecy called apocalyptic literature. And we're familiar with apocalyptic literature, right? When you hear the word apocalyptic, is there a particular book of the Bible that you think about? Revelation. There we are. Awesome. There was a couple of others mentioned as well, which is probably true and right. Sometimes we don't even remember that they're that they're apocalyptic. Revelation is not the first apocalyptic book that we deal with. We deal with 4 different books in the Old Testament that are apocalyptic, and all of them come from this stage onwards. Ezekiel is one, and you've also got Daniel and Zechariah, and when we get to Zechariah, we're going to unpack what apocalyptic literature in more depth. But apocalyptic literature is a form of prophetic writing that uses, and I will read this because I've chosen these words very carefully. Apocalyptic literature uses images and symbols to convey hope to their present day. See, apocalyptic literature uses images and symbols to convey hope to their present day. Repeat that twice so you get it. It's not this big thing about the future. It's not some big crystal ball kind of imagination about what might happen at the end times. In fact, the word apocalyptic means to uncover, to reveal. It has a very present implication, not so much a future implication. And I think people always think, it's always got to come where where are we going to uncover this stuff and really understand it, where the future comes. But it's not necessarily that at all. It's going to be an uncovering in the present age to help us understand what is happening in our day. Or rather, what happened in their day. The people who receive this message, they're going to peel back the curtain so that they can see what's actually happening underneath, what's actually happening here. And we have done so much damage to our understanding of prophecy and eschatology, which is the study of the end times, because of a rampant misunderstanding of what apocalyptic literature functions in the ancient Eastern world. And the description is so central to our study. I'm going to repeat it again. Apocalyptic literature uses and utilizes symbols and images to convey hope to their present day. Ezekiel's not trying to prophesy about future events and how they will go down. He's most certainly not laying down a blueprint for how things are going to happen in Babylon or what their return is necessarily going to look like. It's not a step-by-step blueprint at all. Ezekiel is trying to talk to the Jewish people about their current world and their current situation. And he's going to use symbols and images to try to communicate this message of truth, of strength. And Ezekiel 4, it's a pretty interesting story that we've had read to us this morning. Ezekiel's not maybe an author like we might think of some prophetic writings and his books. He's much more like a thespian. When we talk about guerrilla theatre, Ezekiel is the poster boy for it. And he takes his apocalyptic imagery and uses it to perform this guerrilla theatre. Ezekiel is going to run into a busy part of town and enact a prophetic message from the Lord, and then jet out of there on a dead street and leave the audience to discuss what's happened, like a flash mob kind of thing. And even, to be honest, I was struck again, even though I've spent a fair bit of time in this, to rehashing this study this week, just hearing this guerrilla theatre being read again. And I think it's because it's the morning, and I didn't have the best night's sleep, and part of it was I couldn't get comfortable, and I tend to lie on my right side to go to sleep, but because I was laid there for so long, like my arm had fallen asleep, and it was that notion of 390 days of laying on, and I was thinking, gosh, I don't even think I can manage an hour really without fidgeting. 10 minutes really, probably, if I'm honest. And yet 390 days. And then he gets to flip over for 40 days, which must have felt like, heaven really, in comparison. But we hear Ezekiel being told by God to build a model of Jerusalem, and I can imagine Ezekiel building a big Lego model of Jerusalem way before Lego was even a thing. And then he takes his hair and a sword and he cuts some of his hair off, and then he puts it in the model and he lights it on fire, and then he takes a sword and he chops up the model because Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. This is the impending doom. And then he's commanded to cook his food over human poo. Excrement, as it's done. Anybody? Master Chef, anybody? Then he kind of bargains with the Lord, and the Lord goes, oh, okay, you can use cow dung instead. Again, I don't know about you, but I think I would have some complaints about that. And he's like, God, I understand, I'm a prophet, I understand you want me to do some provocative things, but this is hard, this is hard. It's not a fun calling, is it? We hear this stuff. It's not a fun calling at all. But being a prophet is rarely fun work. And one of my last ideas I want to talk about with Ezekiel is the idea that Ezekiel is trying to communicate hope to God's people, even in the face of all of this stuff. And as you read Ezekiel, you'll see this transition right into hope. If you've ever read Ezekiel, you're probably going to ask the question, how do you even get anything out of this book? In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of a look at Ezekiel 1. I'm going to read it to you in a moment, Ezekiel 1, because I think you'll have a deeper appreciation of just how crazy different parts of Ezekiel are. And how do you even begin to make sense of it? And it's one of the hardest books, even from a Jewish perspective. This is one of the ones that, the Jews, they really, like, wrestle with a lot. And, when, I've probably mentioned before, but when there's this tradition where they come across questions and instead of like running away from it, which is what we tend to do, or glossing over stuff, they'll dance because they found a question. Ezekiel, there's a lot of dancing because there's a lot of questions, but it's full of detail and nuance. So let's dig into Ezekiel 1, shall we? And have a look at this. We're going to start from verse 4. And I'm going to read it from here, not from my notes, so that we've got it right. So, I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out from the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings of their 4 sides, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left side the face of an ox. Each also had a face of an eagle. Such were their faces. They each had 2 wings spreading out upward, each wing touching that of the creature on either side, and each had 2 other wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures were like burning coals of fire or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel, intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not change direction as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked something like a vault of sparkling like crystal and awesome. Under the vault, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the vault, over their heads, as they looked with lowered wings. As they stood with lowered wings. Above the vault, over their heads, was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, and high above, on the throne, was a figure like that of a man. I saw from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire. and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Well, that's not super complicated, is it? It's super confusing to read. And what in the world does this have to do with anything? How do you ever begin to pull this apart? We've got angels with wings, and there's creatures with eyes all over, and then there's wheels, and wheels within wheels. And wheels don't move, but he gets this glimpse of the glory of the Lord, and the wheels don't move, but he gets a glimpse of the glory of the Lord, and you would expect it to be bigger than our imagination. Whatever the glory of the Lord looks like, it's going to be hard to explain, isn't it? You know, we're going to struggle to comprehend it. It's got to be. It's not going to be possible to put it into our bucket of understanding. You'll have heard me time and time again say, like, if we think we've got God figured out, we've made God too small. We've made ourselves bigger than him. So Ezekiel gets this glimpse of the glory of the Lord, and while I'm not a scholar, I'm not going to try to pull apart all the details here, but just looking at this apocalyptic vision with a step back, with these wider eyeballs, looking at this vision, what are some of the things that stood out to us as the big ideas that Ezekiel seems to be trying to communicate? Things that, if we just could step back and glean from the surface level of chapter 1. Well, I think here's some ideas. You might pick out other ones, but these are ones that I've sort of picked out. There's 4 creatures, and they all have 4 heads, and it seems to be a pretty big theme. And we've talked about numbers and Jewish numerology before, haven't we, and how important certain numbers are to them. And I can't remember whether we've dealt with the number 4 or not, but it's not rocket science. What has 4 points? Correct. Well done, Rob. You know, it's the 4 directions of a compass, the 4 corners of the earth. Whenever you see 4 in Jewish literature, it's like the most inclusive, expansive language. They have 4 faces, meaning they're looking in all 4 directions at the same time. Then there's the fact that they are covered in eyes. There's something about the fact that the glory of the Lord, and in the glory of the Lord, nothing is going to go unseen. Everything is covered in eyes. Plenty of faces looking in all directions, loads and loads and loads of eyes. Nothing is going to be unseen. Everything can be seen. And did you notice that everything moves together? The creatures move together. Their wings are touching all the time. The wheels move with the creatures. Everything's perfectly synchronized. One of the big ideas in this opening passage seems to be wheels. Now, wheel technology hasn't radically changed. No one's gone, let's make them triangle or hexagon. Have they? Wheels are always round. And wheels are always about movement, and everything is moving. And we don't find this with the other visions of the glory of the Lord. When Isaiah sees the presence of the Lord, when other people find themselves in the throne room of God, in their visions, there's not really very much talk of wheels. There's not a ton of them, but when you see them, movement is not something that usually comes up. Yet in Ezekiel's vision, he has this whole big paragraph devoted to the movement of the glory of God. And that's going to be important at some point. He opens his vision. He opens his prophecy with these images of God, and they're very expansive. And it's about how much God can see. And the answer is he can see everything. Then there's this concept of movement, and as I read it, the insinuation seems to be he can move anywhere. which again is incredibly important. Remember, this is being spoken to the people of Judah who are now a people in exile, or about to go into exile, as these opening chapters are. What did they believe about God as far as where he was located? Where did he live? In the temple, which is in Jerusalem. And yet we read in chapter 4, Margaret read to us, didn't we, that it's all going to be destroyed and gutted and wiped out. This idea of God moving not only is an odd concept to them, but this is going to have a huge implication, which is actually where he's going to go to next. A little bit later in his vision, in this text, in chapter 10, if you read Ezekiel 10, we're not going to do that for time's sake, but you're going to see Ezekiel talk about how the glory of the Lord departs from Jerusalem. Anybody want to have a guess which direction it goes? You've got 4. East. Someone's looked. No. No, it goes east. Where do you think Babylon is? In comparison to Israel? It's northeast, but it's east. It's east. So the Bible talks about them being carried off to the north, but they're actually going northeast. And when they get carried off into Babylon, they go east, and the presence of God departs from the temple and goes east. So what's the implications for you as a reader? If you hear this, what do you think? What are you thinking? Where's God going? What? He's going with you. Absolutely. And this is a huge idea. See, Ezekiel's telling me that the temple's been destroyed. And what did we say that some of the questions they may have when they're sitting off in exile? Is God with us? Does God care about us? Is he even real? Where did he go? And Ezekiel is suggesting not only does God care about you, but just because the temple is destroyed, it doesn't mean anything to his presence. And the fact is that he is there for you. In fact, Ezekiel says that the glory of the Lord departed. He departed with you. He's gone into exile with you. He's not left you. One of the things that Ezekiel is doing in order to strengthen God's people is he's going to give a little bit of an explanation. Not an exhaustive or comprehensive explanation, but just enough of an explanation that when you read the prophecy of Ezekiel, you're going to understand what is happening. And you can see this in chapters 16 and 17. Let me encourage you to read this over this next week. It's not a huge book. It's too big to go through like from the front here, like we have done with some of the prophets, but it's not too big to read in a week. But in chapters 16 and 17, it's going to talk about the unfaithfulness of God's people. He's going to say, listen, you got carried off. God went with you, and here's why you got punished. Here's why you're being disciplined. And he offers just a little bit of poetic explanation. And he also offers a bunch of assurance. By the time you get to the end of Ezekiel's vision, in the closing chapters, you will read about how God's presence returns to Jerusalem. And do you think that God's presence comes back to Jerusalem at the end of a prophecy as God's people come back? As the people come back, you see God's presence coming back. And in what direction do you suppose it's coming from? Where have they been? They've been east, so it's coming from the east. From the place where they are just at. God's presence goes with them. As they come back to rebuild, God's presence comes back with them. This is Ezekiel's message of strength. God has not deserted you. God has not forsaken you, and God was not stuck in Jerusalem. He was not somehow trapped when the temple was destroyed. This God has wheels. This God has rims, high and awesome. Always makes me think about those pimped up cars. There used to be a show in the late 90s, early 2000s called Pimp My Ride. And it was all, always was really, ends up being these battered old cars that get done up and really flashy. And I can remember all these like hydraulic stuff and even today, people pay a fortune to have really flashy rims, don't they? Makes no sense to me. Maybe they're better drivers than I am. But like the moment that you clip a curb, like you've costed a fortune, haven't you? But God's got high and awesome rims. It's like, if there's ever a reason to soup your car up. No, I'm only joking. It is lifted, and he goes where his people go, and his glory has departed that destroyed temple, and it went with you to the east. And now, at the end of the book of Ezekiel, he's coming back. God's going to go with you, and he's going to come back with you. I don't think when Ezekiel was writing, the event hasn't happened yet. But there will come a day, Ezekiel says, where you will go back home and you will rebuild. And God's going to go with you. The closing chapters of Ezekiel are not this literal rebuilding of some future temple. It is this apocalyptic vision. Just like in Revelation of what this new home, this new Jerusalem, and this new temple is going to look like. When you come back, because you will, Ezekiel says, you will come back from this and you will rebuild. God will come with you. And this ends up being Ezekiel's message of strength. So I'm going to read some closing notes that I have. Ezekiel gives, where Ezekiel gives strength through. He gives it through encouragement and tells people to continue to press forward and to carry on. But there are lessons to learn from our mistakes. There are promises to hold on to and things we have to believe are bigger and better than our current circumstances. There are reasons to press on into tomorrow and believe that we can be a part of putting the world back together. Ezekiel uses the mind of an innovator, the creativity of an artist, and the imagination of a storyteller to communicate hope to the people of God. And we must be creative. We must be industrious. We must be determined and stubborn for God's ways. The very thing that makes us a stiff-necked people in the desert, if you remember us talking about that, the very thing that does that is the very thing that's going to hold us through the tough times as well. But we must endure, we must overcome, we must be strong. That's our book of Ezekiel. As you read it, there'll be loads of stuff for you to discuss, and you'll be like, what? What on earth? Because there's just loads of weird stuff. And if you like your weird stuff, read Ezekiel. But remember that the basic concepts have shifted and changed from warning to woe to now being ultimately about introducing hope. And hope being the driving force behind the message, because God knows and the prophet Ezekiel knows, and he is the mouthpiece of strength and hope and calling the people of God into believing that God will bring redemption for now. And when you think about it and you put it into our situation, so we're doing this worshiping the waiting stuff at 11 o'clock and midweek, and if you're not part of that, don't worry, you're missing out, but don't worry. We're waiting for the return of Christ. But Jesus gave us a prayer to pray. We'll pray it shortly. We pray it every week because it's part of our communion liturgy. where it says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. That's a present day reality. Living in the now and not yet isn't just hoping and wondering, oh, where is it going to come? When is it going to go? It's about living out this hope together. Knowing that this apocalyptic stuff isn't just, oh, one day everything will be made right. That's true, and that's good, and that's honest, and that's absolutely right. One day Jesus will return. If you know, and I think actually maybe I've said this to most of the groups that we've worked with. I think I live in that, oh yeah, Jesus will return, but I don't, I think for too long I've lived in but it won't happen in my lifetime. Because it's been 2,000 years, so it's probably going to be another 2,000 years. Actually, maybe what happens, what changes if we live with Jesus will return, and maybe it will be in my lifetime, where all things find its fulfillment, where all things find its completion, and all things are made right. How does that change how I live? How does it change how I engage with Scripture? How does it change my expectations of that simple and beautiful line in the prayer that Jesus gave us? On earth as in heaven. That gives me strength and hope. That gives me the stuff that Ezekiel's passing on. Thankfully, without cooking over poo of any description. Thankfully, without lying on my side for 390 days. And the sores,